Step into the whirlwind of Napoleon's empire with Military Memoirs from 1804 to 1814 by Raymond Aimery de Montesquiou-Fezensac, a gripping first-hand account of Europe's most iconic military campaigns. These are his words. Let's begin. While the Third Corps endured the terrible struggles I have just described, the Emperor had advanced swiftly toward Orsha, continually pursued by the light troops of the Russians. The details of this movement are only notable for the tragic death of 300 men from the First Corps who perished in Liadi, trapped in a barn where they had spent the night. When they attempted to escape, they became so entangled with one another that no one could get out. All perished. One man still breathing was finished off with 2 musket shots. As I noted at the end of the 3rd chapter, the army was in a dire situation, and it was imperative to reach the Beresina river before the Russians. Accordingly, Napoleon, without pausing in Orsha, proceeded toward Borisov. This town, situated on the Beresina river and 30 leagues from Orsha, was being held by Dombrowski's division to guard the bridge. Here begins a new phase for the Third Corps. This corps, having solely borne the responsibility of the rearguard from Vyazma for 18 days and over a distance of 60 leagues, was now reunited with the Grande Armée. Marching within its ranks, the Third Corps would now share only the common hardships and privations of the entire force. We had barely rested 3 hours in Orsha when preparations were made for distributions of supplies. Yet once again, even this small relief eluded us. The Russians, having reached the far bank of the Dnieper River, began to bombard the city with incendiary shells. The buildings containing the supply stores were highly visible and became immediate targets. It became impossible to organize regular distributions. A few soldiers managed to retrieve some brandy and flour at great personal risk, but Marshal Davout, now responsible for the rearguard, pressed for our departure. By 8 in the morning, we were on the road to Borisov. This road is one of the finest imaginable, its width allowing several columns to march abreast. For the first time, without concern for the enemy, I had the opportunity to assess the state of my regiment. I had barely 80 men remaining, and how could I hope to preserve even this small number, given they were denied even a moment's rest? I observed with sorrow their tattered uniforms, worn-out shoes, emaciation, and the defeated expressions on their faces. The other regiments of the Third Corps were likely in even worse condition. The lack of provisions alone could have destroyed the army, even without the other calamities that compounded our suffering. Long ago, the supplies brought from Moscow were consumed, the carts abandoned, and the horses dead along the road. As we have seen, the distributions of supplies were sparse, taking place only in Smolensk and Orsha. Regarding the resources of the land, one can imagine what little remained in areas recently traversed by the corps ahead of us. Thus, we survived miraculously, sometimes on flour mixed with water, without salt, other times on a little honey or scraps of horse meat, and with nothing to drink but melted snow. Near Vilna, we encountered a sort of drink made from beets. The severity of the cold had somewhat lessened. Recall that the Dnieper was barely frozen when we crossed it. But this change in temperature brought no benefit. The partial thaw made the terrain slippery, wearing out our footwear and increasing fatigue. Not far from Orsha, I came across Captain Lanus of my regiment, who had lost his sight from a gunshot wound during the capture of Smolensk. A cantiniere from his company was guiding him with great care. He recounted that after being captured and robbed by the Cossacks at Krasnoy, they had managed to escape and were now trying to rejoin us. Shortly after, they were found dead and stripped along the road. The other corps of the army marching with us had suffered fewer casualties than we, but their misery was just as profound, and their disorganization equally severe. Even the young guard was no exception. For a long time, the cavalry had ceased to exist. Napoleon assembled the remaining officers who still had horses into a sort of bodyguard, with colonels serving as non-commissioned officers and generals as officers. This unit, which he called the Sacred Squadron, was placed under the immediate command of the King of Naples. However, The misfortunes of the retreat rendered it ineffective, and it was dispersed almost as soon as it was formed. After 5 days of marching, the army reached the banks of the Beresina River. At Tolochin, we rejoined the main headquarters. The Emperor congratulated Marshal Ney on his crossing of the Dnieper and calmly discussed the dangers that awaited the army at the Beresina, fully aware of their gravity. We spent 2 nights sheltered in the small towns of Bober and Nacha. The same could not be said for Nemenitsa, a village a league behind Borisov, where the proximity of the Beresina caused significant congestion. Soldiers from all corps were crammed together with the wounded. A general whose name I do not know occupied a relatively good house. My regiment's major tried to request shelter from him on our behalf, but his request was predictably denied. Outraged, the major threatened to set the house on fire, a stark testament to the extreme indiscipline of those days. I harshly reprimanded him and, offering an apology to the general on his behalf, spent the night with my officers in a cottage that had lost its roof. Before recounting the crossing of the Beresina, it is necessary to outline the general situation of the army and the enemy. As noted at the end of the 3rd chapter, General Wittgenstein had captured Polotsk on October 18th, forcing the 2nd Corps to retreat from its position on the Dnieper toward the road we were following. As soon as the Duke of Belluno arrived with the 9th Corps to relieve the 2nd, the Duke of Reggio took up position at Bober. After an indecisive engagement at Chasniki on November 14th, the Duke of Belluno held General Wittgenstein at bay until the 22nd, then began a retreat to rejoin the Grand Army. On the other hand, Admiral Chichagov, advancing from Moldavia, captured the city of Minsk on November 16th and seized all the stores gathered there. His vanguard took the bridge at Borisov on November 21st, despite General Dombrowski's fierce resistance, crossed the Beresina River and moved toward the Emperor on the road to Orsha. The Duke of Reggio advanced to meet the Russians, drove them back to Borisov, and forced them across the Beresina, where they burned the bridge. Meanwhile, General Kutuzov, pursuing us from Moscow with the main Russian army, continued his movement on our left flank, coordinating operations with the other forces. Thus, 3 Russian armies prepared to encircle the French forces along the banks of the Beresina. The Moldavian army positioned on the opposite bank to prevent the crossing. General Wittgenstein's corps pressing the rearguard from the right and forcing it toward the centre, and the main army supporting this movement on the left. These formidable attacks were compounded by the impossibility of sustaining the French troops crammed into a very small area, the necessity of building a bridge over the Beresina under enemy fire, and the exhaustion of our army. However, the union of the 2nd and 9th Corps, the latter almost intact, the former in much better condition than ours, was a significant help. We still had 50,000 combatants, 5,000 cavalry, a substantial artillery force, the Emperor's genius, and the courage born of despair. Furthermore, the slow pursuit of the main Russian army rendered it temporarily irrelevant, as General Kutuzov only crossed the Dnieper at Kopis on November 26th, while the entire French army had reached the Beresina on November 25th, 3 days' march ahead of him. The task was to force the river crossing quickly enough to avoid engagement with Kutuzov and to fight only 2 armies instead of 3. The 2nd Corps, positioned at Borisov, was tasked with attempting the crossing. The 9th Corps was to delay General Wittgenstein's advance on the left bank, while the other corps, too exhausted for active operations, were ordered to march between the 2nd and 9th. The Imperial Guard was held in reserve as the final resource. On November 24th, the Emperor began searching for a suitable crossing point. Crossing at Borisov itself was impossible, as it would require building and traversing a bridge under fire from the enemy batteries entrenched on the opposite bank. Downstream at Ukholoda, such an attempt would bring us closer to General Kutuzov, whom it was essential to avoid. Conversely, 3 leagues upstream from Borisov, at the village of Veselovo, the terrain was favourable. The heights on our side dominated the opposite bank, making a crossing feasible, especially as the road to Zembin lay on the far side, offering a route back to Vilna. Napoleon chose this point. On November 25th, feigned preparations for crossings were made at Ucholoda and, more convincingly, at Borisov. Admiral Chichagov, with only 20,000 infantry, could not fortify all possible crossing points. He focused his attention on Borisov and downstream, reassured by General Kutuzov that the French army would likely head in that direction. During the night of November 25th to 26th, the Second Corps moved to Veselovo. The Emperor arrived at dawn on November 26th. Cavalry with skirmishers riding pillion crossed the river by swimming and attacked the Russian outposts. Immediately, 30 cannons were deployed on the heights overlooking the opposite bank to prevent the enemy from establishing a position there. Protected by this artillery, the engineers, submerged in the icy water, began constructing 2 bridges, which they completed before nightfall. The Second Corps crossed and drove the Russians back toward the Borisov road. The other corps followed. The Third Corps arrived in Veselovo that evening and crossed the Beresina shortly before dawn. Many men remained on the left bank, intending to cross more easily the next morning, while others dispersed across the semi-frozen marshes of the right bank, desperately seeking shelter from the intense cold. At daybreak, the Third Corps reformed and positioned itself behind the Second Corps in a wooded area traversed by the road. The day passed quietly. Chichagov, having learned of our crossing, gathered his forces to attack us, while the 1st, 4th and 5th Corps, along with the Emperor, the Imperial Guard, artillery parks and baggage, crossed the bridges, which frequently broke under the strain. Initially the crossing was orderly, but the crowd swelled, and confusion soon reached a point where troops had to use force to clear a path. The cold had returned with renewed severity, and snow fell heavily. The fires we lit barely provided warmth. Despite this, I resolved to use the day productively. Since Smolensk, I had neither the time nor the courage to assess the devastation of my regiment. That day, I resolved to confront this grim reality. I summoned the officers and conducted a roll call using the roster I had brought from Moscow. How much had changed since then? Of the 70 officers, barely 40 remained, most of them sick or exhausted. I spent considerable time discussing our current situation, praising many for their truly heroic conduct, reprimanding others for showing weakness, and promising all that I would continue to lead by example. Almost all the company cadres had been destroyed at Krasnoye, making discipline far more difficult. I reorganized the remaining soldiers into 2 platoons, one of grenadiers and skirmishers, the other comprising the centre companies. I designated their officers and instructed the rest to take up muskets and march with me at the regiment's head. By evening, the 9th Corps suffered a grave misfortune on the right bank. The Duke of Belluno had reached Borisov on November 26th, still pursued by General Wittgenstein. On the 27th, he took position on the heights of Veselovo to cover the crossing and prepare for his own. General Partounot's division, acting as rearguard, was left at Borisov with orders to join later that night. However, misled by a lack of guides and apparently deceived by enemy campfires, the general took a wrong turn, falling into General Wittgenstein's lines. His entire division of 4,000 men was captured. With no further obstacles, Wittgenstein rapidly advanced on Veselovo. The following day, November 28th, fierce fighting erupted on both sides of the river. Admiral Chichagov on the left bank and General Wittgenstein on the right joined forces in an effort to repel our troops and drive them into the Beresina. Opposing Chichagov's attacks were only the 2nd Corps and part of the 5th, with 3 weak battalions stationed on the main road serving as reserves. These battalions represented the remnants of the 1st, 3rd and 8th Corps. The battle raged for some time, but the 2nd Corps, overwhelmed by superior numbers, began to falter. The reserves, coming under closer fire from the enemy's cannon, fell back. This retreat caused a wave of panic among the isolated soldiers sheltering in the woods, who fled in terror toward the bridge. Even the young guard wavered. At that moment, salvation could come only from the old guard. We were prepared to conquer or die alongside them. In an instant, the tide turned, and the very place that seemed destined to become the tomb of the Grande Armée bore witness to its final triumph. The Duke of Reggio, having heroically resisted, was wounded, and Marshal Ney immediately took command. The illustrious warrior, who had saved the Third Corps at Krasnoy, now saved the entire army and the Emperor himself on the banks of the Beresina. He rallied the Second Corps and boldly launched a counter-offensive. His experience guided the generals, and his courage inspired the soldiers. Doumerc's cuirassiers broke through enemy squares and captured cannons. French and Polish infantry supported their efforts, seizing 4,000 prisoners and 5 cannons. We cheered the brave soldiers who brought back these splendid trophies. Their valor decided the outcome of the day. Chichagov, unprepared to face such formidable opposition, did not renew his attacks. Night fell, and the Second Corps held its position while the other corps retreated into the woods and resumed their bivouacs. That night was as grueling as the previous ones, but the ones deserving of pity were no longer us. It was those who remained stranded on the opposite bank. The chaos had steadily worsened throughout the day and the night of the 27th. On the morning of the 28th, the bridge designated for vehicles finally collapsed. Artillery and baggage trains moved onto the bridge meant for infantry, forcing their way through. The only troops left on the far bank were 2 divisions of the 9th Corps, alongside a countless mass of wagons, all types of vehicles, isolated soldiers, and non-combatants, including many women and children. Explicit orders had been issued prioritizing troop crossings, while wagons, wounded, sick, and other stragglers following the army were to cross later, protected by the 9th Corps at the rear. However, with General Wittgenstein having captured General Partouneau's entire division, he attacked the Duke of Belluno near Veselovo on the morning of the 28th, intensifying the efforts that Admiral Chichagov was making on the opposite bank. The Duke of Belluno demonstrated extraordinary skill and bravery in his defence, but under relentless pressure from superior forces, he could not prevent the enemy's advance. By evening, Russian artillery took up advantageous positions and fired into the chaotic masses covering the plain. The ensuing panic was unparalleled. Horses and wagons trampled over fallen men. Each person, consumed by the instinct for self-preservation, sought to clear a path by knocking down those nearby or pushing them into the river. Amid this pandemonium, cannonballs struck those still standing, shattering vehicles. Many perished on the bridge, while others attempted to swim across, only to drown amidst the ice. As night fell, the 9th Corps continued to hold its ground. Finally, the Duke of Belluno began withdrawing his forces in successive movements, breaking through to the bridge, crossing it in haste, and setting it ablaze. The dead and dying who covered the bridge were engulfed by the waters, while all those left on the far bank fell into enemy hands. This included baggage, a large portion of artillery, private carriages, trophies from Moscow, and everything that had previously survived the army's disasters. More than 15,000 men either perished or were captured in this horrifying day. The Beresina had been crossed, and the Russian plan had failed. Yet the deplorable state of the army made it increasingly difficult to withstand further attacks. The 2nd and 9th Corps, which had sacrificed themselves to secure our passage over the Beresina, were nearly as weakened as the rest of us, and the army's salvation now depended on the speed of its retreat. This portion of the retreat, the most disastrous of all, was nothing more than a hasty flight, or rather a long, chaotic route, devoid of any military operations. The hope was to rally the army at Vilna under the protection of a few troops stationed there. However, 54 leagues still separated us via the detour through Zembin, which rejoined the main road at Molodechno, and this direction was chosen. On November 28th, after Chichagov's attack was repelled, Napoleon left the banks of the Beresina, heading to Zembin with the Guard and the 1st, 4th, and 5th Corps. On the morning of the 29th, the 2nd and 9th Corps began their retreat, followed by the 3rd. The road to Zembin was a causeway elevated over marshes, built of wood, as were many in this region. Several long bridges spanned watercourses flowing into the Beresina. This terrain made the march slow and arduous, since the marshes, only partially frozen, required the entire column to traverse narrow causeways. However, there was some consolation in knowing that if the enemy, less focused on defending the route to Minsk, had concentrated more attention on this road to Vilna, they could have trapped us by burning a single bridge and leaving us to perish in the marshes. After one such defile was crossed, the Third Corps paused to regroup. Here I saw a pitiful procession. Officers of all ranks, soldiers, servants, and a few horsemen struggling to lead their mounts, along with wounded and crippled men supporting one another. Each recounted miraculous escapes from the disaster at the Beresina, grateful to have survived despite losing everything. Among them, I noticed an Italian officer barely clinging to life, carried by two soldiers and accompanied by his wife. Deeply moved by her devotion and care for her husband, I offered her my place near a fire. Her love blinded her to the futility of her efforts. Her husband had already passed away. She called out to him until the truth became undeniable, and she collapsed unconscious over his body. Such heart-wrenching scenes were common whenever we paused, accompanied by quarrels between soldiers fighting over scraps of horsemeat or a handful of flour. For a long time, survival had depended solely on forcibly seizing provisions from others or stealing them while their owners slept. That same day, I learned of the death of Alfred de Noailles, aide-de-camp to the Prince of Neuchâtel, who had been killed the previous day near the Duke of Reggio. Until then, I had not lost any close friends, and this news caused me deep sorrow. Marshal Ney, to whom I confided my grief, offered only this stoic response. It was apparently his time, and better we mourn him than have him mourn us. In such situations he always displayed the same cold detachment. Once I heard him reply to a wounded man pleading to be carried off the field. "What do you expect me to do?" "You're a casualty of war." And he walked away. This was not out of cruelty, but the hardships of war had hardened his heart. Convinced that all soldiers were destined to die on the battlefield, he accepted it as natural. The Third Corps reached Zembin on the 29th and Cayman on the 30th. Shortly after the march resumed, the Duke of Belluno declared he could no longer handle the rear guard. He even attempted to move ahead, leaving the Third Corps exposed to the Russian advance, sparking a heated exchange between him and Marshal Ney. Napoleon's authority was invoked, and he ordered the Duke to remain at the rear and protect the retreat. However, Ney doubted the Ninth Corps' support and decided to remove the remnants of the Third Corps, the few officers and the regimental eagles, from danger. A small force of about 100 soldiers capable of fighting was assembled under the command of a captain to act as Ney's escort. The rest departed Cayman at midnight under General Ledru, aiming to join the Emperor and march with the Imperial Guard for protection. The urgency was immense since the headquarters was already a day ahead, advancing quickly. For 2 days and 3 nights, we marched almost continuously, halting only briefly when exhaustion demanded it. During these pauses, we would gather in barns, protecting the regimental eagles and the few armed soldiers standing watch. An order was issued to destroy the eagles and bury them, but I could not bring myself to comply. I had the staff burned and the eagle concealed in a standard-bearer's sack, remaining by his side at all times. A renewed directive called for officers to arm themselves with muskets, but this was impractical. The officers, sick and utterly drained, lacked the strength to wield a weapon. Several perished during this stretch, including one newly married officer found dead near a fire, clutching his wife's portrait to his chest. Near the small town of Ilia, we narrowly avoided capture by Cossacks. A battalion of the Old Guard, left behind with Count Lobau to secure the position, helped us escape. On December 3rd, we rejoined headquarters between Ilia and Molodechno. but the grandeur of that headquarters at the campaign's start was now unrecognizable. The guard marched in disorder, their faces marked with despair. Napoleon travelled in a carriage with the Prince of Neuchâtel, followed by a few surviving wagons, exhausted horses, and mules. The Emperor's aides-de-camp, as well as those of the Prince, led their horses, which could barely stand, and occasionally rested by sitting behind the carriage. Amid this desolate procession, a crowd of crippled soldiers from all regiments marched without order. The dark pine forest we traversed added to the sombre atmosphere. Emerging from the forest, we reached Molodechno, where the main road from Minsk to Vilna branched. Reaching this junction before the Russians was critical to prevent them from cutting us off. The speed of our march narrowly averted this disaster, but the enemy harassed us relentlessly. Since the Beresina, their three armies had pursued us on separate routes, Chichagov's Moldavian army ahead, Kutuzov advancing on our left flank, and Wittgenstein pressing on our right. The Sixth Corps, commanded by General de Vred, had retreated after the Battle of Polotsk, moving progressively to Doksistsy and continuing its march via Vileka and Nemensin toward Vilna. This movement covered the army's right flank, but the Sixth Corps was so decimated that little support could be expected from it. The Cossacks, ambushing the column unexpectedly, slaughtered almost defenseless individuals caught in their path. At Plechnitsi, the Duke of Reggio, who was injured, was attacked in a wooden house where he had taken shelter. A cannonball shattered the bed on which he rested, causing him another wound. His survival was owed to a few equally wounded officers who defended the house until the first French troops arrived. At Chotovisky and Molodechno, the Ninth Corps, serving as the rear guard, was fiercely attacked and utterly routed. The Duke of Belluno even declared this would be his final effort, and that, given the state of the troops, he would hasten his march while avoiding any engagements. Napoleon, realizing that nothing further could be achieved with an army in such ruin, and fearing the impact the news of this disaster would have in Germany, decided to leave the army and return to France to request reinforcements for continuing the war. The timing was opportune, as occupying Molodechno had reopened communications with Vilna. On December 5th, he wrote the famous 29th Bulletin at Smorgoni and departed that evening by sled with the Grand Marshal, the Grand Equerry, and Count Lobau, his aide-de-camp, leaving the King of Naples in command of the army. This departure was met with mixed reactions. Some decried it as abandonment, while others took solace in believing the Emperor would soon return at the head of a new army to exact vengeance. Many simply wished they could leave as he had. For the army, this event marked another calamity. The confidence inspired by the Emperor's genius had kept morale intact, and the fear he commanded maintained discipline. After his departure, disorder ensued, and the King of Naples' orders only further undermined his authority. I previously mentioned that the remnants of the Third Corps had joined the Imperial Guard for protection. The day after Napoleon's departure, the King of Naples ordered them to the rear guard. However, General Ledru, who commanded us, continued the march regardless. The Loison Division, 10,000 strong, along with 2 Neapolitan regiments, had arrived from Vilna to take up position at Osmiana to protect the army's retreat. After just 2 days of bivouacking, without a single battle, the cold reduced them to nearly the same condition as us. The poor example set by the other regiments completed their disorganization. They were swept up in the general rout, and all the remnants of the army poured chaotically into Vilna. At this point, recounting each day's march in detail would be redundant. It would merely repeat the same miseries. The cold, which seemed to have briefly lessened only to make crossing the Dnieper and Beresina more challenging, returned with greater intensity than ever. The thermometer fell first to 15 and 18 degrees below freezing, then to 20 and 25. The harsh winter crushed men already half dead from hunger and exhaustion. I will not attempt to describe the scenes we witnessed. Imagine endless snowy plains, vast pine forests, villages half burned and deserted. and through these desolate lands, a massive column of wretches, most of them unarmed, trudging aimlessly and collapsing at every step alongside the carcasses of horses and the bodies of their comrades. Their faces bore the marks of despair or utter defeat. Their eyes were lifeless, their features blackened with grime and soot. Sheepskins and scraps of cloth served as makeshift shoes. Their heads were wrapped in rags, their shoulders draped in horse blankets, women's skirts, or half-burnt hides. Whenever someone collapsed from exhaustion, their companions stripped them of their rags before death claimed them. Each bivouac resembled a battlefield the following day, with the dead lying next to those they had slept beside the night before. A Russian officer from the vanguard, witnessing these horrors more clearly than we could in our frantic retreat, painted a scene that leaves little to add. The road we travelled was littered with prisoners, now beyond our supervision and subjected to unimaginable suffering. Many crawled aimlessly along the road, their bare, frost-bitten feet leaving trails of blood. Some had lost the ability to speak. Others, consumed by a savage stupor, attempted to roast corpses for sustenance. Those too weak to gather wood huddled at the nearest fire they could find, stacking themselves atop one another. As the fire's feeble warmth dwindled, so too did their last breaths. The houses and barns these wretches set ablaze were surrounded by corpses. Those drawn too close to the flames lacked the strength to retreat as they were engulfed. Others, laughing maniacally, hurled themselves into the inferno to perish. Amid these horrors, my regiment's destruction weighed on me profoundly. That was my true suffering, the only suffering I truly acknowledged. Hunger, cold, and fatigue were nothing compared to the anguish of watching my comrades, my family, perish. As a colonel, it felt as though I had been appointed only to preside over their annihilation. Shared adversity had forged deep bonds among us, and I found in them the same attachment and concern they inspired in me. Never did an officer or soldier have a morsel of bread without sharing it with me. This mutual care was not unique to my regiment. It existed throughout the army, where authority was almost paternal, and discipline often stemmed from affection and trust. Contrary to claims that officers were disrespected or mistreated at this time, within the regiments, colonels continued to command respect commensurate with their merit. The only solace amid our miseries was to remain united, helping and supporting one another. Thus we pressed toward Vilna, counting every step, crammed into wretched cabins near headquarters, arriving at night and departing before dawn. A single drummer from the 24th Regiment led us. He was all that remained of the drummers and musicians of the 3rd Corps. On December 8th, 5 days after Napoleon's departure, we arrived at the gates of Vilna. That day, with General Ledru's permission, I went ahead to learn what awaited us in the city and what resources it might offer. Upon reaching the gates, I found chaos comparable to the Beresina crossing. No measures had been taken to restore order, and while people were suffocating in the crush at the gates, nearby pathways remained open, but unknown to the crowd. After struggling through the mob, I finally entered the city. However, it was impossible to determine where the 3rd Corps would be stationed. Confusion reigned at both the governor's office and the municipality. Night fell, and I had no idea where my regiment was. Exhausted, I entered the residence of the Prince of Neuchâtel, whose servants were scattered. After dining on a jar of jam without bread, I fell asleep on a wooden plank, postponing my search until the following day. That concludes the 15th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.